Well, a very good morning to everybody joining us from America, and a good afternoon or good evening for those based elsewhere. My name is Jo Nussbaum. I'm the Director of Communications for the Legatum Institute, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today to showcase our United States Prosperity Index. To provide a bit of background for anybody who's not familiar with us, the Legatum Institute is a London-based think tank with a bold vision to create a global movement of people committed to creating pathways from poverty to prosperity and the transformation of society. And our work is really focused on developing practical solutions and data tools that will help build inclusive and peaceful societies with open economies and empowered people. As part of that, our Centre for Metrics creates indexes and data sets that measure how prosperity is changing, and that includes the US Prosperity Index. We're very grateful for the generosity of the Helmsley Charitable Trust, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, which has allowed us to draw on our 13 years of experience measuring prosperity globally in order to create this comprehensive analysis of how institutional, economic, and social well-being is evolving across the 50 states of the Union and Washington, DC. Just to let people know that the index data, our latest reports and profiles for each of the states are all available on our dedicated website, which is www.usprosperity.net. We really hope that you will find this event useful to consider how the US might emerge more prosperous from the current health, social and economic challenges it's facing. We'll put up a slide with the running order for today. We'll have a couple of presentations from our speakers, and following that we have some exceptional panelists joining us today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Carol Graham. She is the Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, a Research Director on Global Economy and Development, and a Senior Scientist at Gallup. Carol's undertaken extensive research into the economics of happiness and published a number of books on the American dream. We've also got Dina Sherif, the Executive Director at MIT's Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship. Dina has over 20 years international experience in a variety of fields, including sustainable development, corporate sustainability, youth engagement, philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, youth unemployment, and women's economic inclusion. And finally, we will have Valeria Budinch, the Chief Executive and founder of Ashoka Full Economic Citizenship, and a scholar in residence at MIT Legatum. Valeria is a leading social innovator and an entrepreneur with over 30 years experience in doing business and social innovations designed to create a more inclusive and sustainable world. So just a massive thank you to our three panelists. We're really looking forward to hearing your reflections on the index and on the challenges and opportunities facing the US as you see them. Following the presentations and the panelist reflections, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose questions throughout the event. It'd be really helpful if you could let us know your name, where you're from, and if there's a specific person that your question is to be directed at. And apologies in advance if I don't manage to get to your question. I will do my best to get through as many as I can. If you have any general comments you want to make, you can also use the chat function and exchange thoughts and ideas with other attendees. But that's enough from me. Without further ado, we will kick off today's session with an introduction to the United States Prosperity Index from the Institute's Director of Policy, Dr. Stephen Brien.
Thank you, Jo, and good morning to you all. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here today to share with you the second year of our work on the United States Prosperity Index. I thought it might be useful to start by stepping back a bit and really unpacking what we mean by prosperity. What does that word really mean? What are we really trying to get at it to measure? So when we think about prosperity, the key components that we're trying to drive at, on the next slide you'll see, are economic well-being and social well-being. one level, this is what our sense of what policymakers should be striving for throughout the full gamut of their domestic policy agenda. And I think, as I'm sure you're all aware, I have been thinking about it over the last few weeks from a social inclusion point of view, and from the last few months in terms of the impact of health and economics and how they interact. Prosperity is ever so more important and ever so more salient. That simply running the numbers by GDP is obviously no longer enough to get a well-functioning society where everybody can reach their full potential. And that really has been what we've been doing for the last 13 years, as Joe mentioned. Really trying to get our arms around what does prosperity mean, what are the component parts, how do you measure, how do you track it? And we start at the top level by looking at 3 domains: an institutional domain where we ask, do we have inclusive societies? And I'll unpack that in a minute. An economic domain where we're asking, do we have open economies? And empowered people, which looks at the lived experience of people's sort of living conditions, material well-being, health, education, and how they're experiencing the natural environment. But that's quite a high level view. The next slide, we focus on really diving into some of the detail. This lays out our definition of prosperity. And you'll see there in 3 colors, the 3 domains I was mentioning. But also then within those, a series of pillars, and then within that again, a set of very policy-focused elements. But let me walk you through these and give you a little bit more flavor. So the first domain within inclusive societies, we look at institutional structures, and these are both the formal ways and the informal ways in which people interact with each other. So we think about safety and security, which is about the sort of level of peace and violence and crime in a society. Then we look at freedoms, personal freedoms. We look at civil rights, social tolerance, the degree of discrimination, how much agency do people have to fulfill their own life's purpose. Then under governance, we're thinking, how well is society organized? How are those political structures? Are they accountable? Is there rule of law? Are governments held to account? Are they free of corruption? Are they transparent? And then finally, social capital, which really talks about the bonds between us at the most core level in terms of the quality of family and personal relationships, to social networks, to the degree of trust we have between ourselves and strangers. And then institutional trust, where we look at how trustworthy is government, is the media, our corporations. And really, in today's world, that the trustworthiness of institutions has become so important to track. The middle domain, open economies, the orange domain in the middle, we look at the business environment where we focus on how easy is it to start, to grow, to develop a business in terms of access to finance, labor market availability, restrictions maybe around occupational licensing, and other things like that. This next one, market access infrastructure, we're looking at the core elements of what you basically need to run a commercial economy in terms of, is there good transport links, road, rail, air, etc.? Is there communication? Is there broadband coverage? Do people have enough internet coverage? And are the core resources such as access to water, for example, for farming, electricity and other energy sources for manufacturing? The third element of economic quality is when we look at the outcomes of all that. So it's all very well saying I've got some good inputs, but are they getting translated into a humming economy in terms of dynamism, number of companies that are being started, labor force engagement? How high is the employment rate? Is the productivity and competitiveness level high? And is the fiscal setup sustainable so that you don't find yourself a few years down the road, with unfunded pension liabilities and things like that ultimately will come back to bite taxpayers? And finally, the third domain, empowered people. As I mentioned, that's about the lived experience. So we look at living conditions, level of poverty, nutrition, access to clean running water, housing, all the core elements that really fulfill that sort of basic needs for individuals to be able to live their lives. Then we focus on health, education, natural environment. And that for us across these pillars, in effect, captures the main areas that we think interact with each other that are required to provide a fulfilled and prosperous society. But by measuring it, by defining it carefully, what we're able to do is then by bringing everything together, we're able to say in a particular state or county What's the level of civic and social participation? How does that relate to education? Or to what extent is the quality of governance interacting with it, or freedom and discrimination? And is there a relationship between discrimination and health outcomes? Or what's the relationship between education and the business environment? And the real power of this is by curating a set of indicators all on a common basis. We have a very powerful starting point for diagnosing either at a national, state, or local level what the issues are, and really starting to understand the interactions between them. So we've been doing this, as Joe mentioned, for 13 years around the world. And what we have found when we were doing that was saying, look, when we look at the US, what we see on the next slide is a real stark headline around the quality of the US prosperity. It's the economic powerhouse. It's ranking 4th globally in open economies. But around that, the other domains, the other areas are less good. And really the question for us is when we then look at the US on a global positioning, we see areas like safety and security and education and health bringing it down. So the US is ranked 18th globally. And that's not where one might think it could or should be if it's the big economic powerhouse of the world. So really what that started to prompt us thinking was, well, what's going on here? Why are these rankings poor? Why is there a poor level of health ranking when the US has some of the best health networks, best hospitals in the world, and the best pharmaceutical businesses, etc. But of course, it doesn't take me to tell you that the level of access to health, the quality of health is somewhat uneven. It varies quite a bit. Likewise, the level of crime is quite uneven. And really that starts to get us to thinking about the US, analyzing the US as a single entity is probably not the most effective way of really uncovering and diagnosing the situation. That it's been much more important, particularly in a federal setup, to look at the states. How does that vary? How does safety and security vary between states, between Massachusetts and Mississippi? What's the level of access to finance in Texas versus Oklahoma? And really trying to get under the skin of these variations. And that's what drove us then to develop the United States Prosperity Index, which we launched last year, and we are going to be refreshing and republishing in the coming weeks. And that captures the essence of prosperity as we've laid it out in those slides, looking at inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people across the 50 states plus DC. And that has thrown up, for us anyway, a lot of very interesting findings and thought-provoking questions, which has ultimately led us to do more work at an even more granular level. But before Shaun shares those details with you, I'd like to introduce you to a short video that gives you some of the highlights of what we found from our first foray into prosperity across the 50 states.
The Legatum Prosperity Index shows that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, overall prosperity in the US had been rising for the past decade, although long-standing challenges mean that prosperity was not experienced equally by all Americans. Although the country was ranked high for economic pillars, it was falling behind in living conditions, health, and safety and security. Our US Prosperity Index shows that the country's economic quality had improved as unemployment had fallen after the financial crisis. This meant it was in a strong position before the virus hit, but of course that strength is now at risk. Improvements in education and living conditions had also been significant in driving the growth and prosperity over the past 10 years. Although education had been improving, school closures as a result of lockdown measures put the progress made on educational outcomes at risk. More positively, one area of living conditions that had improved significantly over the last decade was connectedness, with access to broadband rising in both rural and urban areas, enabling greater connectivity during lockdown. Health in America had improved over the first 8 years of the past decade, so the country was in a good position to deal with the impact of the pandemic. However, the mental health of Americans had already been declining even before the coronavirus crisis. There had been large increases in drug overdose deaths, rates of suicide, and levels of serious mental illness across all regions, with 48 states seeing mental health decline over the past decade. Deteriorating social capital was also impeding further prosperity. While personal and family relationships had strengthened, Social networks, institutional trust, and civic and social participation had all deteriorated. The fact that only 11 states had seen an improvement in social capital since 2009 is a real concern, given strong communities are the cornerstones of society, and the decline in other states is indicative of societies that were already coming apart rather than drawing together. Despite these national challenges, the US Prosperity Index shows that before 2020, prosperity had improved in 47 of the 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., providing a strong foundation on which to build a recovery as the country emerges from these challenging times. But while all but 4 states had seen prosperity improve, no single state has yet succeeded in fostering a high degree of both economic and social well-being for its entire population. Other than top-ranked Massachusetts, no state ranked above 20th in all 11 pillars of prosperity. Now more than ever, it is vital that all states seize the opportunities to learn from each other, to increase their prosperity, and share their experiences with one another to help them improve.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Shaun Flanagan. I'm the Director of the Centre for Metrics at the Legatum Institute. It's my pleasure today to talk you through some of the sort of key findings from the index. But before I do that, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time just acknowledging our 40+ experts that helped develop the USPI. So as Stephen mentioned, we took our global prosperity taxonomy and we wanted to apply that specifically to how prosperity unveils or is exhibited within the US, and we are very grateful to experts in health, education that assisted us not in just developing the taxonomy that Stephen talked us through earlier, but also in identifying the relevant indicators that would best proxy measure those 48 policy-focused elements. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to them, and I think a couple of them may be on the webinar today. So on the left-hand side here, you have a map of the 50 states of the Union and DC, and it just sort of shows how prosperity is displayed across the US, sort of grouped in equal bands of 5. And on the right-hand side, you've then got how that breaks down across the different pillars of prosperity for the first 35 states. So what you can see here is there is actually a bit of a north-south divide in prosperity across the US. I think we have 8 of the 10 weakest performing states, in the southern US, and the strongest performing states are in the northeast of the US, although that's not universally the case. We also find that Colorado, Utah, Washington State, and Minnesota also perform well. So I wanted you to spend a bit of time looking at Texas through the United States Prosperity Index. So when we look at Texas, what you can see from this table here, hopefully, is that overall Texas ranks at 38th in the index on overall prosperity. But as you look across the different pillars of prosperity, you'll see that its performance is very varied and mixed. Perhaps not surprisingly, on the first 3 pillars around its open economies, it performs well. And I think it ranks 4th overall for open economies. But when you look at the inclusive societies and empowered people, it doesn't perform as well. Then when we look at see how prosperity has changed across Texas over the past decade, we actually see that it's improved sort of broadly along the lines of the US average. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there how that is sort of portrayed across the different pillars. So we can see that in the open economies domain, we can see that actually it's seen big improvements, particularly on economic quality, sort of a mixed performance across inclusive societies, where it's improved on safety and security, personal freedom, but has seen a deterioration in governance and social capital. However, when we look at the empowered people domain, it has seen an improvement across all different pillars, but its ranking is still relatively low to other states. So what I want to do now is just talk you through this sort of idea of identifying strengths and weaknesses within Texas. So this sort of aligns with the messaging that we were talking about earlier, where every state has the opportunity to learn from another state and also can benefit another state where there is a strength. So let's take education, for example, in Texas. So what you see here is education overall. Texas ranks 41st. And then you also see the different elements that make up education. And this broadly mirrors the sort of educational stages throughout the sort of life cycle of a pupil or a student. So pre-primary, secondary, tertiary, and then concluding with the sort of adult skills of the population. And what you see on this table actually is that Texas doesn't perform particularly well. It sits in the bottom half of the table for all different elements and on particular adult skills. So what indicators underpin adult skills? So that's made up of two indicators. One is around the percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher, and then the other is the adult population with at least a high school diploma. And what you see here is that obviously with high school diploma, we see that Texas ranks 50th overall. But when we want to see how these sort of portray throughout sort of different indicators across education, what we're seeing here actually is that Texas is not curating high-skilled labor supply, particularly what we see in the rural areas through our county index. Actually, what we do see when you look at the bottom is that that deficit actually begins in sort of pre-K. We see that pre-primary enrollment is behind the US average, as is the pre-K quality is also behind. And then that continues throughout all different stages of education. Now, we'll return to this later on as we look at trying to develop perhaps a bit of a roadmap for Texas. But if we can go on to the next slide. Here, what I just want to talk through is economic quality. As we said earlier, not a surprise that Texas economy is strong, it's big. I think it's the sort of second strongest state economy in the US, and therefore we see that it ranks third overall for economic quality and has risen 2 places in the rankings over the past decade. But when we look at the different elements of economic quality, I just wanted to focus a little bit on dynamism. So these are the indicators. Sorry if it's a little bit grainy on the screen. These are the indicators that underpin dynamism. So what we're measuring here is the extent of sort of business startups, the ability for businesses to start, to sort of thrive, to flourish, to create jobs, as well as looking at the rate of new entrepreneurs. And what we see here is that Texas actually performs particularly well across a number of these indicators, particularly on startup concentration and rate of new entrepreneurs. This is a strength for Texas. But if we look at another state where perhaps there is an underperformance, we see neighboring New Mexico doesn't perform as well on dynamism. We see that whilst Texas ranks 4th overall for dynamism, we see that New Mexico ranks 34th. And when we unpack that into looking at the different indicators, what we see here is that, again, across all the different indicators within dynamism, we see that Texas outperforms. So on startup concentration, the sort of early number of jobs created, the early survival rate, but also on opportunity-driven startups and rate of new entrepreneurs. We see that Texas here outperforms New Mexico across all of these indicators. And I think what the learning could be here for New Mexico is what is Texas doing that New Mexico could perhaps benefit from? Is there something around policy initiatives or strategies that it could look to see if they could be replicated within its own state? One of the things I just wanted to touch upon here is looking at how we're prepared for going into COVID-19 and looking at the economic strength, particularly again of Texas, but also other states. So in the economic quality pillar, we're looking at fiscal sustainability. That's the extent of state reserves, budget balance. In productivity and competitiveness, we're looking at the sort of value of exports, both manufactured and non-manufactured, and labor productivity. Dynamism, we've already discussed, the extent to attract and retain new business. And then labor force engagement is the extent to which the workforce is fully engaged, both in terms of low levels of unemployment, underemployment, and also high levels of employee engagement. And what we see here is that we have a number of states I've identified that rank in the top 5 on economic quality, and Texas is 3rd. Their sort of systems, their economic systems, perhaps slightly better placed than those identified towards the bottom of the index, which have sort of fiscal sustainability, less state reserves, don't necessarily have the ability to start new businesses and retain them, you know, as we look at also the unemployment levels, the latest unemployment levels in the final column, you know, it would seem that some of these areas are particularly at risk. Some of these states are particularly at risk from COVID-19 and the impact on its economy. Again, apologies for the slight glitching in the sort of presentation. I hope that's given you a little bit of a flavor. I do want to return and pull a few of these things together towards the end. But what I just wanted to conclude with for the next few minutes is just talking through our county level analysis. So what we've done, as Joe said at the beginning, is over the past year, we've actually developed a county index for 8 states across the US, and that's for New York, Georgia, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, Montana, and California. And what we've wanted to do here is mirror the state level index. So we've taken all 215 indicators and where possible, identified county level variants or county level data sets for those. But we have 83 indicators that are statewide within that. So that's where either the indicator is relevant to all counties within that state. So for example, it might be around regulation or to do with a certain law, discrimination law, for example. But there are also some where we would like county level data, but have not been able to find it. So what we see here is actually how prosperity translates into the individual counties across those states. And I think what will immediately strike you is that there are some states that are pretty homogeneous in how prosperity pans out across states. So we're particularly looking at Iowa, where actually all counties within that state rank in the 2 top quintiles when you're looking at prosperity overall. That's similar in Colorado and perhaps New York. But when you look across other states like California and Montana and Texas, you actually see that there is quite a bit of difference in the levels of prosperity across the state. If we go on to the next slide, just wanted to sort of do a bit of a deep dive into Texas. And then on the next slide, what you see is actually how prosperity maps across for Texas. You've got there on the left the strongest and the weakest counties within the state of the 254 counties. And what's interesting for Texas is that only 6 of Texas's counties are in the top quintile for prosperity. And only 34, around 13%, are in the top 2 quintiles in the county index. But if we go to the next slide and look across how that translates into 3 different domains, we do see a slightly different pattern. So when we're looking at inclusive societies and open economies and empower people, you'll see that there is a difference. So when we look at inclusive societies, you often see that it's the rural areas that perform slightly better and the urban areas which are generally in the bottom quintile. When we look across to empowered people, we often find that the reverse is slightly true, that those areas that are more urban generally perform better. And then if we go on to the next slide, please, and look at open economies, I just want to look into this in a bit more detail. So what we find when we look at Texas in terms of open economies, we actually see that it behaves very differently to the other 2 mains. So nearly 60% of all counties in the state appear in the top quartile for economic quality. And in particular, all but 4 counties are amongst the top performing counties for dynamism, which we talked about earlier. That's business startups, entrepreneurs, etc. So this is a unique, to some degree, to Texas, in that the rural counties actually perform particularly well on open economies. And one of the things I just want to look at now a little bit is how can this strength be leveraged to help improve some of the underperformance in what we see across other aspects of prosperities? How might the state go about utilizing this strength to bring about improvement across other areas of prosperity? So if we go to the final slide here, we see that rural Texas counties perhaps share a binding constraint of poor infrastructure. Nearly 40% of its counties are in the 4th quartile of the index. That's in the lowest sort of ranking for communications, and only 13 counties rank in the top quartile for transport. So across the sort of rural area of Texas, infrastructure for both communications and transport is particularly weak. So how might address this? Well, one potential roadmap, and this is obviously something that we've just thought through a little bit and needs further exploration, but perhaps a possible way forward is how does Texas leverage its economic dynamism to attract new businesses that are focused on solving these communications and transportation infrastructure problems. how could it look to leverage in those type of businesses that could help improve the infrastructure? The other area it could look at is investing in rural education. If we go back to the earlier example, where education is not particularly strong across any aspects, how could it improve its rural education? And it could look to initiatives being employed by other states. For example, there's an initiative, a rural education initiative in Montana, so that it could help build local human capital base to help service those particular industries. So improved infrastructure will then also attract other businesses into the middle here. Improved education provides new businesses with a trained labour supply. And these positive externalities may also lead to improvements across other areas of the index. So healthcare, for example, or health could be improved through telemedicine. It could also, through education, lead to higher levels of social tolerance. So all of these things combined together could actually lead to improved prosperity. So obviously this is just a very sort of simple example, taking the data in the index at state level, but also at county level, and so trying to create a bit of a roadmap to seeing how things might be improved in Texas. But obviously with 10 years worth of data, 50 states and DC, 215 indicators, but also the 829 counties with 10 years worth of data and 215 indicators. There is a huge amount of analysis and insight that can be gleaned. And I've only looked to give you a sort of taster today, as it were, through the index, just to sort of show you what's possible, how you can identify strengths and weaknesses. I hope you found it helpful. You know, our call to action really is that state and county leaders and others will use these indexes, you know, to create data-driven, targeted policies that will help create greater prosperity for all Americans. Oh, sorry, just to say that all of our information is open source. It's on the website. I'll just put this up before I hand back to Joe. Please visit there and you can get all the information you need on all of the states and the counties. Thank you very much. Over to Joe.
Thank you so much, Shaun. To discuss some of the challenges and opportunities in more detail, we're going to turn now to our panellists for their reflections and thoughts. Carol Graham, if I can come to you first. You recently stated that the American dream of a life that combines opportunity and hard work with prosperity, stability, and well-being is lying in tatters. How do you see that playing out differently across the different states? And how do you think the country can craft strategies to repair the divides across society and to support those who are most vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19?
Well, you're asking tough questions. I'm trying to be optimistic. It's quite a difficult time in the US, but I think it's an ideal time to bring in the kinds of tools and approach that the Prosperity Index has developed. I actually go way back with the original Global Prosperity Index and was involved early on in this, the attempt to include broader metrics of progress in measuring prosperity and in measuring poverty. Most recently, my work has actually been looking at the US, even though I've essentially a development economist and have worked on well-being around the world. Next slide, please, Michael. And have been using well-being metrics to look not just at equality of income or inequality of income, but very much also inequality of outlooks. In other words, with the underlying hypothesis that I think a lot of my empirical work has shown to bear out is that people's beliefs about their future, their outlooks, and aspirations really matter to their outcomes. And showing that in the US in particular, which was known for so long as the land of opportunity, that this pursuit of happiness, which is really the pursuit of the right to have a fulfilling life, is not equally shared at all. And so I've been using the metrics to explore why increasingly unequal distributions of income, well-being, and hope really matter. And I think this isn't just a US question. I think it's a question for the future of capitalism in rich and poor countries. But I've been focusing primarily on inequality of well-being and the links of that to the so-called deaths of despair in the United States. And then, so we already had some really remarkable challenges. We're the only rich country in the world where mortality rates prior to COVID were going up rather than down, driven by preventable deaths. But then enter COVID. And COVID placed an exponential shock on cohorts who were already disadvantaged and vulnerable. Stephen talked about our health system. COVID has exposed the weaknesses and the inequalities in our health system in spades, and all sorts of other weaknesses in our safety nets, in the distribution of opportunities, in the distribution of education and health. And they're very big differences by state. It's a lot easier to be poor in some states than others. It's not easy to be poor in the United States, but there really is a lot of state variance, and the index really highlights a lot of that, as did Shaun's presentation. So I think the fundamental point, of course, is that income measures can miss a lot of the story. So again, prior to COVID, we had booming stock markets and supposedly record low levels of unemployment, and yet 20% of prime age males had simply dropped out of the labor force. That's something fundamentally wrong economically, and yet our standard metrics weren't telling us. And yet well-being metrics were telling us that this cohort was toxic, miserable, and dying prematurely. So I think this really highlights why the work of the index team tells us so much more about not only what's wrong in the United States, but how we can fix it. Next slide, please. I'll try and go through this very quickly. So nobody wants to see an equation, particularly not, I think it's 6 p.m. London time or 5 p.m. London time. But there's a reason for this. I'll be very quick. It's just to note, when we measure well-being, the most important thing is that we're not asking people if certain things make them happy or unhappy. We have very large end data. We have the dependent variable is a well-being dimension. It could be life satisfaction. It could be hope for the future. It could be stress yesterday. It could be anger. Those questions are asked up front in the survey, and then we collect all sorts of other demographic and economic information. And we're able to, controlling for those standard variables, we can see what varies in terms of, say, health status or employment status or inflation, inequality, environmental quality. But we aren't asking people directly if those things make them happy or unhappy. So we have what we think is a pretty robust approach, and it's now being used by academics and governments around the world. Next slide, please. Very quickly on this side, which will make you happy or unhappy depending where you are on it. But this is pretty much a universal pattern between happiness and age, with the midpoint being somewhere between the mid-40s and mid-50s in most places around the world. We found it holds for about 140 out of 162 countries in the Gallup World Poll. There are a lot of reasons for it, which I can't get into in detail. One is clearly that aspirations align with reality in the Middle Ages. And then also in the Middle Ages, there are often double burdens of financial burdens, children, older parents, work. And also there's just a psychological trend as people get wiser as they age. But the most important thing here is that the deaths of despair, where people are dying, it's less than college-educated whites dying from alcohol poisoning, drug overdose, and suicide, occur precisely in this same age band, from about age 40 to age 55. So this is it's a difficult time in life, but an amazing number of Americans, 1 million people dead since the year 2000 of these deaths, are just not getting out of the middle age years. I think that's a sign that something's wrong in our society. Next slide, please. This is very quickly where we just decided to start off by comparing markers of stress, which is a sign of ill-being between the US and Latin America, a much poorer region with about the same levels of inequality. And what we find is that Americans experience much more stress on a daily basis, or report to, than Latin Americans. But the big difference is the difference between the rich and the poor. As you can see on the horizontal line, the poorest are on the left and the richest are on the right. These are quintiles. The difference in reported stress between the rich and the poor in the US is much bigger than the difference in reported stress in Latin America, which I found surprising. Next slide, please. And here we have belief in hard work. Simple question, American dream question, basically. Does hard work get you ahead? Yes or no? And what we find is the difference between how the poor and the rich answer this question in the US is 20 times greater than how the poor and the rich answer it in Latin America. And this finding is really what got me started digging much deeper into what was going on with the American dream in the US. Next slide, please. So here's another difference that surprised me, and it holds now even during COVID, which is remarkable. African Americans, there are big differences across race in terms of hope and optimism and belief in the American dream. And what we find, these are just poor groups, whites are the left out group, is that African Americans are almost 3 times as likely to be higher up on an optimism ladder, on a 11-point optimism ladder, than are poor whites. This surprised me at the time. The finding holds even now. During COVID, where African Americans are disproportionately hit by COVID, this is a story of resilience and hope. Hispanics are also slightly more optimistic, but the biggest gap is really between poor blacks and poor whites. Next slide, please. And then you have to click, there we go, thank you. So, and here's the other side of that story. If you look at this is mortality, all-cause mortality rate of the preventable deaths for US white non-Hispanics. That's the red line there that's going up. And then you compare it to France, Germany. The blue line there is US Hispanics. Then the UK, Canada, Austria, Sweden. We're unique with this. And what's remarkable is it's very much driven by less than college educated whites in their middle age years. So we have these 2 stories of hope amidst adversity among minorities in the United States, and then deep, deep desperation and high levels of preventable deaths among poor whites who really have lost the belief in the American dream. And I'll quickly go through the next couple slides. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I can do this quickly. There are big differences in terms of the distribution of deaths of despair across race and place, again, mirroring the kinds of state-level differences that the index finds. And what we find is that basically places that have higher levels of hope, aggregate and individual levels of hope, and lower levels of stress and worry have less deaths of despair. Diversity is a related characteristic. Minorities are more hopeful and less stressed. And here you get the share of blacks and Hispanics being positively correlated with optimism and life satisfaction, and negatively correlated with deaths of despair. The same places are places that are more economically vibrant, but they're not just economically vibrant. They also display a lot of the other traits that are in the index, that things like social capital and other things that make economies and places work better. Next slide, please. So here you get, for example, just a view of the state level differences. This is the mortality rate, and as you can see, the South doesn't look very good, as it doesn't look in the prosperity index. And you see the deep, those dark states, places like Kentucky, Missouri, and a few others, Louisiana, stand out for very high levels of mortality. You also see over to the west also some increases in deaths of despair. And if you were to track these same places with the indicators in the prosperity index, I think you'd find a lot of similarity in terms of what is wrong. And it isn't just an economic story. Next slide, please. And then here what we find is very big differences in places where minorities are optimistic and where whites are optimistic. Now this is controlling for objective indicators, but again, you see differences. The dark green is optimistic. Minorities are at the bottom, in the bottom table. And as you can see, some of the same places that don't score very well on economics and poverty, for example, that southern cluster of eastern states at the bottom of the second map, but minorities are very optimistic there. So what would explain that? And remember, we're controlling for poverty and health indicators and everything else. What explains that is social capital and shared cultural experiences. The southeastern cluster of states is rich with African-American culture and churches and music and food. And the same goes when you look at the left side of that map, where you get another concentration of minority optimism, and that's a place where Hispanics are clustered and have that same shared sense of culture, concentration, social density. So we have a lot to understand about differences across place and how those also matter to economic and health outcomes. And, this is one way to look at it, and what the index does is another. I'm going to skip this slide, except that to note that we're doing some very new work trying to understand hope and resilience, and that we find, again, that hope and resilience seems to be passed down from parents to children in minorities in the United States, and also in poor places like Peru, where I've done some pilot surveys, and also that historical optimism. We know that optimism is linked to longevity, but we find historically in the United States, African-Americans increased in their optimism in the 1970s when civil rights improved. And the only group that decreased in optimism around the same time were less than college educated white males. And that occurred about the same time of the first manufacturing decline. So you're seeing, even historically, that these patterns could have been predictive of the problems we're looking at now had we been tracking well-being. So just to conclude, I won't go through the markers there anymore, but it's really important to look beyond just the economic indicators. And right now we're looking at terrible economic indicators, but also things like gun purchases going up, for suicide, and a lot of other deep problems in the US, and with big differences across US states. And I think we have a lot to learn from the wonderful information in the index.
Carol, thank you for that. Dina, I'm going to turn to you now. You've got a wealth of experience working in the US and internationally across different sectors of the economy. What are your reflections on what we've presented today, and how do you think the index could be used to encourage more inclusive business growth?
Thank you so much, Jo. And thank you for inviting me to join and remark. It's a pleasure to be with the Legatum Institute as the Legatum Center. I'm going to try to be brief so I can also give Valeria some time to comment. I think, for me, I think the Prosperity Index is a great thing specifically in the context of the US, because it really reveals where you have differences across states, but also across counties. And I think that's a very important focus area for the US when we think about prosperity. Having said that, I think that prosperity is a very tricky thing. My experience with many years of working in sustainable development is that we think we can get prosperity by fixing poverty and inequity, and I think that that is true. We do need to fix prosperity and inequity. But the question is, if we really want to fix it, what is the best way to go about it? And I think that so far, we haven't been doing all that great in many parts of the world, the US included. And I like to think that we need a new framework. And, very recently, I've gotten close to the Clay Christensen Institute, Ofoso Ojomo in particular. And he often says that we can't get to prosperity by trying to fix poverty, but we can get to prosperity by focusing on a different framework, which is how can we think about creating markets, new markets using innovation in ways that are extremely inclusive in nature and that take social inequity to heart. So I think in terms of how the Prosperity Index can be used in the US for inclusive business growth and to think about market creating innovation, specifically in some of the counties that you talked about that weren't faring as well versus counties that were, is for, I think, agencies like the Small Business Administration in the US that focus on small business growth to really think about how they can use the Prosperity Index to hone in on areas within the US, within states, and also actual states that are not doing as well from a prosperity perspective. And where can some of that money flow to really think about business growth from the bottom up? But then how can we work with entities like the Small Business Administration to drive home principles like inclusivity? So when they do deploy that capital to areas that really need to do better from the prosperity side, how can they start influencing the way business is done? How can they start influencing the kind of innovations that they invest in that would lead to inclusivity? Are the kinds of questions I think that we should be asking that we're not necessarily asking. I think moving on from that, we rarely focus on the venture capital or risk capital space. And I think that's extremely problematic when we're talking about prosperity, because how capital is deployed really matters, I think, in creating inclusive growth and prosperity. And I think and the Legatum Center has recently focused a lot on having meaningful conversations with venture capitalists and really talking to them about how their money can really shift to thinking about innovation that will lead to prosperity. And in the US in particular, we see venture capital that is focused in certain urban centers and mainly in states that are doing very well from a prosperity index. So if we look at entrepreneurship in the US, we see places like Massachusetts, we see places like Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And if you look at Texas, I think, Austin has emerged as this enormous hub of innovation, and I'm sure that that has had impact on prosperity in Texas. But I think the question is, how do we get that capital to move to areas where we don't see prosperity? And to do that, we need to be having much better conversations with risk capital and venture capitalists to see money move around differently, but also to work with them to uncover innovation within these areas that are falling behind. And I think, the question for me is always, how do we start bringing more stakeholders together around this discussion of inclusivity and market generating innovations that will lead to inclusive growth? I think bringing in philanthropic capital into the equation of mixing philanthropic capital with venture capital, with good public policy, can go a long way in seeing business growth where it's really needed, but business growth that is inclusive where it's really needed. So I think my hope is that we can start using the index to have these kind of discussions and to really take that forward. And I know we're short on time, so I want to hand it over to Valeria as well, because I think she's also been thinking a lot about prosperity in the current times in different countries, but also in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dina. And Valeria, I'll hand straight over to you. I think that's a fantastic introduction. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and how you see the situation in the US compared to some of the work you've done around the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. I would like to have a reference from the perspective of business and social entrepreneurship and innovation, and point to the fact that has the data and the comparison that the index establish, it help us see and differently, and at the same time, it helps us point to new solutions, and that's where innovation and entrepreneurship are key. In looking at the index and hearing the presentations today, it's clear that it triggers awareness of where new responses are needed. What do we need to fix? But more importantly, it's pointing to the interconnectedness of many of these issues and the fact that you need systemic solutions. And those systemic solutions require to think beyond access. And how we think about that, it's one thing that in a moment I will go deeper on why it needs to change. What is remarkable also about the index is this ability that brings us to compare and learn from others, other states, other practitioners. And at the end of the day, it's also, as Carol was pointing, and also Dina, the very notion of prosperity is advanced by the existence of the index. So why innovation and entrepreneurship is key here, because all over the world, those that are actually going from seeing differently to doing differently, the key actors are business and social innovators and entrepreneurs. And there is where, and their role is precisely to imagine new ways to address issues like digital inclusion, like education in an era like the COVID era. Same thing when it comes to, for example, with COVID, this notion of reinventing the care industry, reimagining assisted living and avoiding the kind of catastrophe that we have had all over the world, and on particularly in the Western world on this topic is crucial. And how to do it both from a perspective of well-being and at the same time with solutions that are market-based and sustainable and scalable, it's key. So how could the index allows us to see differently and at the same time move towards a new solution, new generation of solutions, is something that at the Legatum Center at the MIT, we're working with students, helping them looking at this sometimes intractable problems has new opportunities for innovation, and enabling the kind of conversations that will lead to systemic solutions. We hope to do more of this and use more systematically the information like the one in the index to enable those conversations and open the possibility for a different future. Thank you.
Valeria, thank you so much for that. I'm conscious that we've had an hour together already. I know some people may have to leave. I believe all of our speakers are able to stick around just for another 5 or 10 minutes. So I am going to try and run through a few of the questions that we've received. People have been great. Completely understand if you do need to head off. So just to say, if you do, please keep checking out usprosperity.net. But in the meantime, to pick up on a couple of the questions that we've been asked, Shaun, I'll come to you first. Daniel Griswold has asked, given the rankings that we saw with most of the states in higher ranking states in the Northeast and the lower ranking states in the South and the Southwest, how do we explain the fact that Americans are continuing to migrate from those higher ranking states to some of those lower ranked areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we were out in the US. We had the privilege to be out in the US at the end of February, where we were doing a kind of road show and promoting the index. And we did six events there, mainly on the East Coast, and then going down to Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma. And that was a question that was raised as well. And I think migration is the part of any healthy economy. I think you want people free to move around, free to be able to pursue their dream and look for, where they want to locate. Now, some of the challenges with the Northeast states are obviously that they high cost of living, education is probably more expensive. So people will relocate. And one of the things we want to do now that we've got the county index is really to sort of look at migration patterns and see how they sort of correlate with the index. That's a piece of analysis that we're like to do, but it is something that we're aware of.
Great, thank you, Shaun. Stephen, coming to you next. Clementine Manning has asked about how we think the current account deficit of the US will have an impact on its prosperity going forward.
That is, these questions are getting harder and harder. I think there's a high level issue around the whole set of trade flows around the world that is predominantly driven by a search for safe assets. And to a great extent, if we go back to some of what Carol and Dina are saying, if we can increase hope, increase level of optimism, and business entrepreneurship, and shift the ability of the US to sort of absorb risk capital, there may well be a way to change the current account balance. But I wouldn't see that as being the core necessary of the issue for prosperity in the United States. our sort of study of nations around the world is that some of these deeper structural issues ultimately lay the foundations for these flows of funds. So make the opportunities for investment good, make the opportunity for trade good, and then the flows of funds will follow those opportunities.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Carol, turning to you, I think a number of attendees found your slides on optimism among different minority groups really interesting, and quite a few attendees have asked us sort of how you think the recent protests and some of the shifts that we've seen in the social issues that have arisen in the US and around the world, how you think those might reinforce or perhaps change some of the trends that you've been seeing in your data?
That's a great question, and I wish I had that data already, but I don't. The polls, the COVID survey that we did ended it right before the protests, unfortunately. We will be repeating it in August, so we'll get a better look at what's happened during the protests. I've seen a little bit of data that suggests rises in anxiety among minorities, particularly African Americans, but I don't think that, I think that can actually coincide with continued optimism. I've been looking at this finding of optimism among African Americans and Hispanics, but again, particularly among, the biggest gap is between poor African Americans and poor whites. And it just doesn't go away. It didn't go away with Trump's election and all of the horrible racism that followed. I think, if anything, the widespread nature, not just around the US, but around the world, of primarily peaceful protests and the amount of momentum around that, as well as what we're seeing now, which is the system standing up against Trump's abuse of power, against his misuse of the military, against his attacks on the LGBTQ community by the Supreme Court, which several of his nominees voted against his measure, is going to, it's positive momentum for behind this whole set of causes. So I can certainly understand why there's anxiety. Who isn't slightly anxious at the time? But I don't think you're going to see this differential in optimism go away. What we have among the very toxic groups I mentioned, for example, prime age white males who've dropped out of the labor force, is a lot of anger and a lot of despair. And unfortunately, that is much harder to reverse than is the optimism among minorities.
Thanks, Carol. And it'll be fascinating to see those results once you're able to get the data through. I'm going to ask one final question to Stephen Brien, hopefully slightly easier than my previous one for him, which is just wanting to think about how comparable our US rankings are to our global rankings. And if so, kind of where the states at the top and the bottom of our rankings would sit in a global context.
Sure. So I think, like, we've sort of had a mixed discussion in terms of sort of attitudes and hopefulness today, and I think quite rightly, because there's a lot of mixed messages to come out of this report. But I think when you step back and say, like, in the global context, where do the 50 states sit? They range pretty well at the top level of our global index. You'd have Connecticut, close to the top of the US index, would be the equivalent in prosperity terms of, say, Germany, which would be 8th globally. Michigan would look like Belgium, down towards the bottom end. Mississippi would be comparable to Portugal. And that's 25th in the index. So you sort of see that the states of the United States fall in the top 25 countries of the world in a ranking of 150. So generally pretty high up. And even at the lower end, when you look across the waters at somewhere like Portugal, that is the baseline for US prosperity. So I think there's a reason to be hopeful as well that in an international context, this is broadly a good story, but to reinforce a lot of unevenness, and that's really where the agenda needs to be.
Thank you for that, Stephen. I'm conscious that we've already gone over our hour together, so I'm going to bring the question and answer session to a close there. But thank you to everybody who sent questions in. Apologies if I wasn't able to get to yours. And a huge thank you to our speakers and panelists for sharing their thoughts. We really hope that you found this presentation useful. You can find out more information, including all of the data at www.usprosperity.net. And this is actually just one of a series of webinars that we are hosting over the coming weeks. So please do tune into any of the others that you might be interested in. We will post a registration link in the chat. So we would love it if you are able to join us. The next 3 will look at particular states. And then we've got a health-focused event in partnership with the American Public Health Association on the 1st of July. We'd invite you to make full use of the index and all the related resources that are freely available. And please don't hesitate to get in contact with us if you do want to follow up on anything that's been said during today's presentation. But for now, I'll just say a huge thank you for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure to bring you all together. And a special thank you to our guest speakers for giving up their time. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.